with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Then they came to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. The people were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. In their synagogue was a man with an unclean spirit. He cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus rebuked him and said, "Quiet, come out of him." The unclean spirit convulsed him, and with a loud cry came out of him. All were amazed and asked one another, "What is this?" A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. His fame spread everywhere throughout the whole region of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Good afternoon. It is good for us to be here. This week, the readings lead us to think about prophets. Moses spoke about a new prophet raised up by God from among you, from your own kin. In the gospel, Jesus was recognized as a prophet by the authority with which he taught. The authority the people recognized in Jesus led them to have great trust in him and in his message. The authority and trust of Jesus were even more firmly established when Jesus showed the power he had over an unclean spirit. What do you think of when you think about prophets? Prophets upset the status quo. Prophets get people to think. Prophets introduce new ways of thinking. Prophets are different. They are individuals. They are filled with spirit. They are passionate and excited about something. They are loving and caring and may even talk a message of tough love. Prophets have dialogue with God. Prophets are passionate and powerful. Prophets stir things up. Prophets have God's ear. Do any of these qualities describe you? Do they describe me? Do they describe any of us? The old school teacher inside of me wants to give all of you a 4-question test. So here's your 4 questions. If you've been baptized, raise your hand. Okay, put your hands down. If you're a priest, raise your hand. If you're a prophet, raise your hand. If you're a king, raise your hand. Well, surprise, surprise. If you've been baptized, you could have raised your hands 4 times, because by virtue of our baptism, those baptized are anointed priest, prophet, and king. We will soon stand together and affirm our belief in the power and authority of God's prophet and in us. In the creed, we will say, "I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified, who has spoken through the prophets." We believe God spoke through the prophets. The prophets' words are God's words, and since we're prophets, our words should be God's words. One way to think about prophesying is to be able to speak for God, to do God's work. It is natural to think about the named prophets and their stories in the Bible. Just last week in the first reading, we heard the story of Jonah and how he was guided by God to lead the people of Nineveh to change their evil ways, put on sackcloth and ashes, and avoid having their city destroyed by God. One of my favorite stories about the prophets is the story of Abraham in the Old Testament and how he had such an intimate relationship with God that he was able to bargain and negotiate with him. Remember the story when God threatened to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham said, no, don't do it. What if there's 50 righteous men in there? And God said, I will not destroy the city. And then when Abraham went on to say, well, what about 40? What about 30? And he got it down to 20, and then eventually 10. And God relented and said, I will not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if there are 10 righteous men in the city. In the first reading we heard today, Moses spoke to the people and told them how God would raise up from among them a great prophet, talking about Deborah, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and eventually Jesus, who was to come. The story of Moses is a fascinating story. Moses had the power of God on his side. Moses raised up his hands, and the Red Sea parted. Moses raised up his arms, and the Israelites were given great power in battle. Moses called upon God, and God sent manna into the desert every day for 40 years as the Israelites wandered in the desert until they reached the promised land. The biblical prophets had a message of hope. When people did what the prophets led them to do, it brought them God's grace and good things. But the people didn't always do what the prophets told them to do. But one thing to pay attention to is how the prophets acted when they met with rejection. When there were bad consequences, there was no response from the prophets, such as, I told you so. The I told you so message was not necessary because the people were able to realize and come to understand the power of God. We are all prophets. There are prophets in our midst. Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. Prophets can appear in the most unexpected places and situations. I remember some years ago when I was riding the red line subway deep in the bowels of the earth under Chicago, and the train was crowded and the stations were crowded. And at one crowded station, a gentleman stepped into the crowded subway car, and all he said was, folks, when you pray, don't pray for riches, pray for wisdom. And then he stepped out, the doors closed, and the train went on. And I thought, what a profound prophecy. We shouldn't pray for things. When we have wisdom, we have the ability to get all that we need. This was a prophet in our midst. Some 20 years ago, some of us who've been here for a while may remember two Felician sisters who came to visit our parish, Sister Veronica and Sister Margaret, from the Rio Rancho mission they had. And I'll never forget it. They walked around this church, they sang, they played the guitar, they preached, they talked about their mission. And I've been coming to church here for 65 years, and I have never been so moved and felt so close to God is when these two little sisters were walking around. It was like Christ himself was in our church. These were prophets right in our midst. People we know may recognize prophetic virtues in us that we don't see in ourselves. When people we know ask us to pray for them, they are recognizing us as prophets and know that we have communication with God. I have had people ask me to pray for them, which I always say I'm glad to do, but then I go on to tell them, well, you can pray too. But once I had a gentleman tell me, well, when you pray, it works better. The idea here is to put our humanity, the humanity of the prophets, and the humanity of Jesus together. Jesus said, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I came not to abolish, but to fulfill." In fulfillment, Jesus brought God into the world. This applies to us. As followers of Jesus, we bring his fulfillment into the world. As a prophet, Jesus rejected his divinity and embraced his humanity. The church teaches that Jesus was like us in all things but sin. By virtue of his divine nature, Jesus could have done it all. He really didn't need any help. He was God. He could have commanded that the great kingdom be established on earth at once, but he didn't. Instead, he chose to identify with us and with our humanity and embrace the disciples and embraces us to help him to do his work. By the human nature Jesus chose to embrace, he couldn't be everywhere and do everything by himself. We are the fulfillment of Jesus. We are Jesus in the world. This is an awesome responsibility. We might look in the mirror and say, "Why me, Lord? Why am I your fulfillment? What can I do to be your fulfillment?" We are all empowered by God to do great things and to make a difference. The God of the Old Testament needed the prophets. Jesus, as God made man, needed the disciples. The world needs modern-day disciples and prophets to carry out the work of God. We may not realize it, but at every Mass and every time we share in the Eucharist, God gives us the power to serve him. One of my favorite parts of the Mass is often very discreet. When the priest or the deacon prepares the water and wine to put into the chalice, there is a prayer that is quietly said. It is, "By the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ." The power and the divinity of Christ become an example for us as prophets, as human beings, to know that he loved us so much that he became one of us. We are called to be attentive to our mission as prophets. The psalm we heard today reminds us, "If today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts." The second reading we heard today from St. Paul to the Corinthians encourages us to be open to prophecy, to do God's work without distraction, to work to serve God free of anxiety, and to prevent things of this world from getting in the way of things of God. As followers of Jesus, we are called to exercise prophetic ministry like Moses and Jesus did. The readings today invite us not only to pray for prophetic leaders, but also to exercise our own prophetic gifts, both within and outside of our faith communities. May God continue to bless us.